Hi, I'm Heather Staines, the Head of Partnerships for the Knowledge Futures Group, and I'm very excited for you to join us today for our session, Publishing for Everyone, Increasing Accessibility and Disability Inclusion in the Scholarly Communications Industry. We have four amazing speakers joining us today. Mary Beth, if you can jump to the next slide. Thank you. I'm going to introduce all of them, and then we'll move into presentation mode. So first up is Bill Kasdorf. He's Principal Kasdorf and Associates. He focuses on the editorial and production workflows, XML, HTML, EPUB modeling, standards and best practices, and accessibility. He's a founding partner of Publishing Technology Partners. Bill is the W3C Global Publishing Evangelist and is active in the W3C publishing at W3C Work. He co-chairs NISO's Video and Audio Metadata Guidelines Working Group, is a member and past president of SSP, and is also a member of BISG's Workflow Working Group, IPTC, and the DAISY Consortium. He received the SSP Distinguished Services Award, the BISG Industry Champion Award, and the IDEA Alliance Dear Luminaire Award. He is general editor of the Columbia Guide to Digital Publishing and serves on the editorial board of Learned Publishing. Clients have included NEJM, National Academies Press, American College of Physicians, American Psychological Association, SAGE, Harvard, MIT, Toronto, Taylor and Francis, Cambridge, IEEE, Cochrane Library, Pearson, Cengage, VitalSource, World Bank, British Library, OCLC, ORCID, and the European Union. Try to say that 10 times fast. Second, we've got Simon Holt. Simon is publisher, Micro Nanotechnologies and Reference Content Volume Strategy, Diversity and Inclusion Campaigner at Elsevier. He's chair of Elsevier Enabled, an international group of employees representing people with disabilities, and also sits on Elsevier's Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. His mission is to project a positive image of people with disabilities throughout the publishing industry. Next, we'll hear from Stephanie Rosen. She's accessibility specialist and librarian at the University of Michigan Library. As accessibility specialist, Stephanie helps the University of Michigan Library promote equitable access to resources for all users, regardless of ability or background. Her responsibilities include leading library-wide engagement with accessibility, developing educational materials for staff and public, and collaborating with partners to advocate for accessible scholarship, publishing, and teaching. She has a PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin and has worked at the intersection of accessibility and higher education since 2010. And finally, we'll hear from Letty Conrad. Letty is a publishing and product development consultant. In her nearly 20 years of publishing, Letty has led user-centered web and mobile product development, focused on driving research and analysis that enables evidence-based product management for a portfolio of global clients, maybe as large as Bill's, maybe larger. Accessible publishing has become an area of expertise for Letty and her product R&D consultancy. She also serves as North American editor for Learned Publishing and is a chef at the Scholarly Kitchen, among various contributions to the SSP community. Please thank all of our speakers for joining us here today. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about how we're going to be organized today. We wanted to liven things up a bit and get a bit interactive. Maybe I can ask our speakers to shut off their webcams so we can create a little bit of drama. Thank you. So each speaker will introduce their area of expertise through a little scenario. That will be followed by a few minutes detailing their particular interest and some of the things that they want to highlight. That'll be followed then by the next scenario and the next speaker. And we'll do questions for the panel at the end. So I want to welcome you to our interactive scenario. We have specially crafted for your viewing pleasure a scenario for each speaker. And I would like to welcome our special guests, the SSP Theater Troupe, otherwise known as Howard Ratner and Sue Kestner, both SSP past presidents and joining us here today. And with that, I will hand over to, go to the next slide real quick, Mary Beth. Hand over to Howard and Sue in our scenario 1. Accessibility is hard, right? A publisher meets with their vendor. You will be playing our publisher, and Howard will be playing our vendor.
I know we should be making our books and journals more accessible, but sheesh, there's just so much to deal with these days, so much to juggle, and my budget isn't getting any bigger. Now I'm supposed to be providing accessible formats too? Come on, give me a break.
Don't worry about it. We've got you covered. We can take care of a lot of this for you, and we can help you do the parts you need to do. It's not rocket science.
Well, then why aren't we already doing it?
Remember those specs you gave us about 5 or 6 years ago? We're still using those specs because, well, you never gave any update to them.
I just don't know where to start.
Okay, take it away, Bill.
All righty. So actually, it really isn't as hard as it used to be. It's actually a lot easier than most, particularly scholarly publishers, think. The reason is that the whole motivation these days is to, sorry, I'm supposed to turn my camera on, is to make sure that your publications are really just born accessible in the first place, so that they don't need special workflows or a lot of post-publication enhancement. It's just that the publications we make from everybody else should be accessible from the start. Now, we're not there yet, but we're really getting a lot closer. And interestingly, and surprisingly to most people, scholarly books and journals are closer than you realize. A lot of people think, well, accessibility is all about HTML and EPUB, and we're all about JATS and PDF. Well, actually, the way we do JATS and PDF position us really well for making our content accessible. So let me walk you through that. First thing is that our workflows are really very accessibility ready. Our content's really well structured. JATS and BITS XML gives us that. Math is almost always MathML, which is what accessibility assistive technology needs. Our tables are well structured, and we used to have a different table model, but now pretty much always we do HTML tables, which is exactly what assistive technology is looking for. So really the main thing missing is the image descriptions. And one thing I really advocate in my consultancy is that for scholarly publishers, this is not true of every kind of publishing, but for scholarly publishers, you need to start with the authors providing the alternate text for images, because they know why they put those images in their article or their book. Yes, you have to refine that, but you need to get that initial content from them. And another reason I say that it's way easier than it used to be is that now standards for accessibility are pretty much all based on web standards. It's all about the open web platform, and two specific aspects of it are very important for accessibility. One is called WCAG, which is the foundation for accessibility for the web. And another is ARIA, which, among other things, provides semantics for assistive technology to use. And so, again, unlike really not too many years ago, now almost all international standards and requirements for accessibility, including US Section 508, which was refreshed just a couple of years ago, now all converge on these fundamental web standards. And then finally, the file formats we use are the ones that accessibility wants. The proper format for exchanging interchange of accessible content is EPUB 3. And we know how to do EPUB 3. Our vendors know how to do EPUB 3. We're not talking about a special kind of EPUB 3, just EPUB 3 done properly with correct HTML5 markup. And yes, we do want that ARIA markup to add semantics for assistive technology, but I can't stress this enough. Our upstream formats, like our JATS and BITS XML, already has that kind of information. So, for example, in the DPUB ARIA group of terms, it's a way of saying this is a chapter or this is a footnote. Those are just very fundamental, and again, it's not rocket science. In terms of standards, EPUB Accessibility 1.0 is where how to make an EPUB properly accessible is specified. You need proper navigation and structure so that assistive technology can find things. You can skip to chapter 3. You can skip footnotes. You read things in the right order, etc. And then don't forget about accessibility metadata, because that describes how accessible the publication is. And by the way, proper accessibility metadata for EPUB is identical to what's in schema.org. 3 services I thought I'd mention to you. ACE by DAISY is a free EPUB tester that analyzes an EPUB and reports back to you everything that automation can tell you that needs to be fixed, or gives you a clean bill of health for your accessible EPUB. SMART is another DAISY technology, and that facilitates the human review. So, for example, ACE can tell you if there's alt text on an image, but it can't tell you if the alt text is any good. SMART helps you do that. And then finally, Benetech is helping to certify publishers' workflows and publications as accessible, so you can know that you're getting it right routinely. Here are all the resources that I mentioned in this talk, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bill. We're switching over to our next scenario. Bill, you can turn your camera off now if you'd like. Mary Beth, next slide. Scenario number 2, diversify your workforce. In this scenario, and I will invite Sue and Howard to come back and join us again. Thank you so much. In this scenario, 2 publishing colleagues are discussing a potential hire.
I saw a job candidate waiting in reception. She had a seeing eye dog.
Yeah, I just finished the interview. It was really great, and there's so much interest in this position.
Yeah, but I'll confess the situation really worries me a little.
You're worried that a visually impaired person couldn't do the job?
Well, what if some of our colleagues don't like dogs?
Well, I don't like some of my colleagues, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be here.
Thank you so much. And with that, Simon, you can turn your camera on. Thank you. And go ahead, Mary Beth, the first slide for Simon's presentation, and then Simon can take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name's Simon Holt, and I'm visually impaired. I work for Elsevier. I'm a publisher, and I'm also an advocate for disability and inclusion and accessibility within the publishing industry. Next slide, please. So what does accessibility mean to me? Well, I think the key part of the word accessibility is actually access. We often think about accessibility in terms of being able to read everything, and that's true, and that's really important, but it goes beyond that. It's also about that as somebody with a disability, I have the same opportunities as you. I can go for the same jobs as you. I can take part in the same meetings that you can take part in. In short, it's about thinking about being judged for what I can do and what I can offer, instead of being judged for what I might not be able to do without even asking me. Nothing about us without us is a saying that we often use in the disability community. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I wanted just to kind of paint the picture of what the disability employment landscape looks like, particularly within the publishing industry. As you can see from the stats here, it's not a terribly pretty picture. As you can see from the top right-hand side, the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't just think about physical disabilities, but it also talks about mental and neurological disabilities. And I think that's really important to think about, in that 15% of the population actually have a disability. But then when you look at the workforce, actually, if we think about the publishing industry, the disabled community is massively underrepresented. And what also really alarms me is that only a third of people with a disability would actually feel comfortable talking about it at work. That means that we've got a cultural issue that we really need to change if we're to become a more inclusive industry. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, it's important to me because I have a disability and having a job is important, but it's important to you as well because not only do diverse teams perform better, but actually, if I think about my own career, any success that I've had isn't despite having a disability. It's because I have a disability. It's because having a disability has given me problem-solving skills and and the ability to be adaptable and the ability to connect with other people. These are all skills that maybe I would have had otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have had otherwise. But they're fundamental to who I am, and I believe it's because I have a disability. Why would you not want these skills as part of your business? If nothing else, because as an industry, we're just at the very beginning of this journey. If you as a publisher are hiring from a pool of disabled candidates that other publishers are not hiring from, you have a competitive advantage. And finally, it's important because when we think about our customers, actually, our customers are just like everybody else in the world. So 15% of the population has a disability. 15% of your customers have a disability too. As publishers, we're the gatekeepers. And if we're not representing our community, our customers, then we're not going to be able to provide what it is that they need. Next slide, please. So that's all great, but what does it mean for me? The question I get most often is, you know, I really believe in all this stuff, but how can I action this within my organization? And so I've tried to just put some kind of starting off kind of guidelines here. So, you know, the most important one is at the top. Ask people what they need. Don't assume that they need something when they might not. Don't assume they don't need something they might. Ask people, you know, how can I help? What is it you need? Everybody is an expert on themselves. And just as I couldn't talk about somebody else's disability, don't assume that you know what I need either. Ask in an open way is always the best way. Second thing is have a process. When you have somebody with a disability apply, don't panic. What you really want is a process that you already have from application to interview and then to their first day. That's really important because then you'll feel more comfortable, so the candidate will be more comfortable as well. And then when they're in the workplace, there's a few things to think about. So assistive technology is something that I'd mention. Assistive technology is all around us. I'm wearing glasses today. That's assistive technology. I have an iPhone. That's assistive technology too. Often these options are quite cheap. So I use a lot of apps, for example, on my phone that are either free to download or very inexpensive. The Voice Dream Reader is something that I would particularly point as something that's very good, that is a very kind of high spec automated reader that I think costs about $15, so not expensive at all. I also just want to mention a few organizations here, Purple Space, Business Disability Forum, Leonard Cheshire Disability Employment Charity, and encourage everybody to think about setting up disability networks in their own organizations, because actually you have a load of experts who, when they come together as a community, can really help shape what your policies and practices are. Finally, I just want to flag up something SSP is involved with, which is the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Publishing, which is doing a lot of great work to increase diversity and inclusion within our community. And that's something that I definitely recommend that you check out. And if your organization isn't a member yet, please do consider joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, so much. Thank you. Scenario number 3, which will bring in our third speaker, Stephanie Rosen. This scenario is another file request. Here we have the winner for Best Lead Actor in a performance of Accessibility is Hard, right? Howard Ratner? And reprising her role as the publisher, part 3, Sue Kessner. The
Hi
scenario,
again.
a library, sorry, I stepped on your line, Howard, I apologize. I didn't want to do that to a famous leading actor. A librarian reaches out to a publisher for an accessible copy. Please.
Hi again. I'm following up on my email to request an accessible copy of the Columbia Guide to Digital Publishing by Kasdorf. We've already licensed it for our collection. Can you please send the accessible electronic file as soon as possible? It would only be for the accessible patron with print disabilities.
Hello. Well, it looks like your library already subscribes to that item on our ebook platform. Please just let your patron know that they can use the book directly there. We're very proud of our accessibility of our platform.
Well, this patron has already indeed attempted to use the item on your ebook platform, and it's not compatible with the patron's assistive technology. In fact, it's not accessible to them at all. So can you please send along the file as soon as you can?
Well, it may take a little while. I'll need to find the right person to solve this problem to get back to you.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, if you could join us now. And Mary Beth, go ahead to the next slide, and Stephanie can take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rosen. I work at the University of Michigan Library as an accessibility specialist and senior associate librarian. And at the library, I collaborate with colleagues to make our services and resources more accessible for more people. On campus, I work with networks of colleagues to make the university more accessible to and equitable for people with disabilities. And I publish and advocate broadly for accessibility in higher ed, libraries, and adjacent fields. So as a library, we aim to provide equitable access for all our patrons and to support our patrons in navigating our resources in the ways that meet their needs. Unfortunately, patrons with disabilities, especially print-related disabilities, are often not able to complete their research pathways because of barriers to access. So I step in as a liaison. You can advance the slide. There's me, and you can advance once more. So when a patron can't access an item we own because it's in a print format or because it's in an electronic format that is nonetheless inaccessible, either because the content doesn't meet standards or the platform that it's hosted on is itself inaccessible, I use a series of workflows to get the patron a copy they can use. So these include searching specialized databases like Bookshare and Access Text to retrieve a born accessible digital file, using HathiTrust Accessible Text Request Service to download a digital scan of a print item, or contacting the publisher or vendor directly for an accessible file, or locally scanning and digitizing a print copy. Next slide, please. To effectively do this work, I bring specialized knowledge in several areas. First, I need to understand the copyright provisions that allow copying and distributing copyright works for the exclusive individual use of readers with print disabilities. Secondly, I need to know what makes a text more or less accessible and which features are more important for which assistive technology. And third, I need to know about the user that I'm working with. What are their needs, their timelines, and their preferences? So when I approach a publisher for a file, as in the scenario just acted out by Sue and Howard, I'm prepared to answer questions, but I'd really rather they just send along the file that the patron has already been waiting for. Next slide, please. To support this work at the level of the field and industry, we as a library engage in several activities. So I serve as our representative in the Library Accessibility Alliance. That's a joint effort between two library consortia, the Big Ten and the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries. So with that group, we've pooled our resources to hire accessibility firms to test vendor and publisher platforms, and publish the results of those tests, and invite vendors to respond and to improve. We've also created standard license language to help libraries negotiating with vendors and publishers around accessibility, and generally tried to advance transparency in the industry. We've also developed resources for the community ourselves as a publisher at the University of Michigan Press. As we began our work making our electronic books more accessible, we recognized the need for author and editor guidance on writing text descriptions of images within books. So we created a toolkit to support that work with the input of a large group of multidisciplinary experts. And I've written a short book on accessibility in publishing in the Charleston Briefing Series to give professionals in scholarly publishing a readable introduction to the issues in the field and the importance of taking action at this moment. Next slide, please. And next again. So a few resources I wanted to share. The first is a white paper that goes into great detail how copyright does not act as a barrier to providing accessible copies to people with disabilities. The second is the Describing Visual Resources Toolkit, support for authors, editors, and publishers trying to make their publications accessible, and especially the visual resources within those publications. And finally, Accessibility in Publishing, the short book I mentioned, which is available open access online. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And now, scenario number 4, it's like closing night on Broadway. It's a little bit bittersweet, but back by popular demand, one more time with us today, Howard Ratner and Sue Kessner, reprising her role as the publisher. Scenario 4, which will introduce Letty Conrad, platform redesign. A publisher is reminded about the variety of ways researchers interact with scholarly platforms. Thank you, Sue and Howard.
We are really excited about our recent platform migration. We have a fresh, modern design for our online journals and books.
Great. I look forward to checking it out. One of my lab partners has limited use of her hands and uses keyboard controls to navigate the web. Will she be able to use the website?
Gosh, I'm not sure, but I think our team ran an accessibility audit. Keyboard control support would be listed in our VPAT, but we should have your colleague try it out to be sure.
Sure, we can ask her. Did you test your site with physically challenged or disabled readers?
I'm not sure, but I'd welcome a chance to speak with your colleague and test her experience with our platform.
Thank you so much. We'll turn it over to our final speaker, Letty. Take it away, Letty.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Letty Conrad, independent consultant coming to you from my home office in Southern California. I work with publishers and software providers in their product research and development, and designing accessible platforms and accessibility programs is one area of specialty. In particular, as the skit demonstrated, my approach to accessible publishing is inclusive and is rooted in user-centered humanistic values. So to me, publishing for everyone means that we are practicing empathy and investing in positive, productive information experiences for all of our readers at all levels of ability who require access to our products and services. I think, done right, an accessibility strategy offers benefits beyond distributing a VPAT, which Sue, our publisher, mentioned. VPAT, by the way, stands for the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, document that content and software providers use to declare their levels of accessibility. Publishing for everyone means that we're investing in and building up our capacity for empathy and applying that user-centered approach to developing a robust, accessible publishing strategy. Next slide, please. Publishing for everyone requires each of us in this community to practice empathy as part of how we do our business every day. I don't mean exercising pity. I'm not asking us to feel sorry for one another, but instead, business practices that exercise empathy are building in regular daily reminders that we are not our users. We must routinely prompt ourselves, get out of our comfort zone a little, and consider alternate viewpoints. The fact is, information science research shows that we do not all experience information in the same way, nor should we. So empathy in publishing means that we're directly engaging with and learning from members of our various user communities, that we're not assuming that a vocal majority or another speaks for everyone. Simon's suggestions for working with colleagues with disabilities, I think, were spot on and actually can be used to better understand the experiences of our user communities as well. We really can't assume that there is an average user experience or even that that's the goal in our design. Instead, I advocate for our publishers to keep an open mind and to aim to design publishing programs for everyone equally. For example, those of us with full mobility or vision or other capabilities need to keep in mind that we are only temporarily abled. If nothing else, simply the passage of time will impact our mental or physical faculties and possibly change our perspective on the importance of accessibility in publishing, among other things. Next slide, please. Let me bring this into practical terms. Practicing empathy sounds very abstract, right? Academic. But in practical terms, instilling publishing strategies with empathy for our users means embracing a wide range of information experiences and a wide range of information practices across our various communities. Researchers, learners, and other stakeholders need us to keep in mind that there are uneven experiences with vision, impairments that include low vision, blindness, color blindness, lots of variations, but it's not just vision. We're talking also about mobility and dexterity limitations, and that's often where web navigation or functionality navigation is really important. Of course, there's auditory considerations, especially as our multimedia publications are proliferating. So we need to consider not only hard of hearing, but also fully deaf people. And then also, as Simon mentioned, cognitive and neurological issues, from language to learning disabilities. There's really a number of considerations when we embrace a broad information experience. Compliance with web accessibility and content accessibility standards, as Bill and Stephanie both mentioned, those get us a long way toward covering a lot of these bases. But I really encourage publishers and software providers to also consider the user experiences across all of the various touch points with our organizations. It's not just our published content, but also the platforms, the mobile apps, the other services or devices that may enable access to our content. We must consider the author and editor and reviewer experiences throughout the publishing workflow, from peer review on through the various distribution channels. And what about accessibility in customer experiences, such as invoicing, usage reporting, customer service encounters? So this may all sound a bit overwhelming, but I think it really boils down to building these considerations into our everyday routines and our everyday way of doing the business of publishing. I'd suggest that taking actions like conducting accessibility audits, adding accessible publisher developer tools to your IT infrastructure, these are really great ways to get started. An accessible publishing strategy is often best served by empowering either a single department or a cross-functional team that can provide a level of governance, a sort of clearinghouse, to ensure that accessibility is considered at all of the proper points in the program and product life cycles. And I would also briefly mention the need to bring in our chief counsels or our legal teams given the increasing risks of lawsuits and other punitive actions intended to enforce equitable access in scholarly research and in higher education writ large. So with that, I think we're ready to pause and go into some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Letty. And if I can invite our other speakers to turn their webcams back on. And Mary Beth, it's up to you whether you want it to be just our view or whether you want to keep the slide share up. I'll let you decide. So fantastic set of presentations on different aspects of accessibility in publishing. I'd like to open with a few questions. I think I'll start with Letty, and maybe Bill may want to respond to this as well. So back when I worked for a publisher back in dinosaur days, I remember that we mostly thought accessibility was like that stuff that happened over in production, but as you touched on, Letty, it really is something that should affect every single department. Can you talk a little bit about why a comprehensive approach like that is best? You're muted.
Sure, absolutely, and a great question. Certainly don't want to. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. Sounds good. So I don't want to downplay the importance of content accessibility. But as I mentioned, it's not just content, right? It's all of the various touch points. So that means bringing in our colleagues from web design and IT, to handle digital infrastructure. Bring in our friends from editorial to talk about peer review accessibility. Marketing to talk about the various touch points, email, marketing collateral, campaigns of various sorts. I really strongly advocate for a cross-functional accessibility program to be put in place. This takes a lot of the individual stress off, a single sort of czar or, lead in accessibility, and instead makes it a shared endeavor. It needs to be built into just sort of the everyday ways of doing what we do. And that does certainly go beyond content production. But Bill, I welcome your thoughts as well.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything you said. One point I'd like to make is that, the general public thinks that the publisher does all this stuff. And actually, publishers' vendors do a lot of this stuff. So your vendors are your friends in this case, because particularly if you're using a good prepress vendor for your content, you're using a good hosting service for your content, etc., they very likely know more than you do about how to make them properly accessible. I have a client right now that I'm doing accessibility review for. It's actually two of them. One's a medical publisher with a journal, and one's a scholarly book publisher. In both cases, they're dependent on vendors to fix whatever's wrong. And I'll give you an example from the book publisher that lots was wrong with the markup. And I know the two vendors that they're using for their books, and they're very good vendors. And I came to realize that the vendors, and this is why the skit was written the way it was, are using specifications that publisher provided and required them to deliver to about 5, 6, 7 years ago. So when I pointed out the problem, they said, oh my gosh, we've got to develop a whole new set of specifications. I said, no, don't do that. Just talk to your vendor, because they already know how to do that. They'll be able to get it right better than you could specify it. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, you mentioned that you are an author of a book around accessibility, and I just wondered, as an author, when you were going through the publication process, was there anything that you really needed to do, or that you might have done differently because the intended output was to be completely accessible?
Thanks for your question, Heather. This is Stephanie speaking. There wasn't a whole lot that I had to do as an author. The book is relatively short. It's all text, so it just consists of paragraphs and headings. Nothing too complex in the way of content. If it had included figures, graphs, or other types of information, then it would have been my role to provide text description of that content. I also worked with colleagues at Michigan Publishing who were handling some of the back-end production. So I knew that all through the workflow, it was in good hands when it came to accessibility. One thing I'll mention is that the entire book series is really designed to be readable introductions to complex topics for folks working throughout the scholarly communications landscape, but without necessarily the same exact specialization as me. So I certainly thought a lot about how to explain the intricacies of accessibility in language that would be meaningful to a broad audience. So that was probably my biggest concern when it came to accessibility in writing that work.
Thank you. That's great things to keep in consideration. Simon, you mentioned amongst the advice that you give, ask people what they need, how they would approach a problem. That seems like good advice for anyone that you're interviewing, not just someone who might present, with a disability. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned as you've interviewed for positions, as you've interviewed others for positions? Just some general advice on how to be more inclusive.
Yeah, and I think you hit upon a really good point in your question where you said, this is really good advice for anybody. And I guess the point I really want to make here is that, somebody with a disability isn't a different species. We don't come from outer space. And I think sort of sadly, the experience that I've had with interviews are mostly that a lot of people who kind of are, certainly were in the industry when I started, 10 years or so ago, and maybe you now are actually quite scared of people who aren't exactly like them and don't feel particularly equipped to kind of take them on. I think that it says a lot that the successful interviews I've had include being interviewed by a person who it turned out that her daughter is visually impaired, and therefore she was able to understand and kind of empathize a little bit more. I think what I would say to any hiring manager, and it's something that I've thought about when I've hired people myself, actually how the candidate does the job is not your concern. That's what the HR department are for. That's why we have government schemes, whether that's access to work in the UK or the several different schemes that they have in the US. Actually, your job as a hiring manager is just to make sure that they can answer those questions properly and that they have the same opportunities as everybody else to get it right or get it wrong. I think the only other bit of advice I'd give is just make sure that the questions you're asking or the things that you're asking candidates to do actually do really relate to the job that they're going to do. I think it's absolutely fine to say, this job involves X. How would you handle that? Because you could ask that to any candidate. It's obviously not okay to sort of ask very prying questions about their disability. It's actually illegal. One particular experience I talk about is that I went for an interview that involved a proofreading test for a job that wouldn't actually involve any proofreading. Now, obviously, as a visually impaired candidate, I didn't do too well on the proofreading test. And when I asked, well, why is there a proofreading test? They said, well, it's, to kind of exhibit general publishing skills, whatever general publishing skills are. Obviously, I wouldn't have had a problem with that if the job had involved proofreading, but it didn't. So I think from an inclusion point of view, just think about what the job actually will involve and ask questions and test based on that, as opposed to some other arbitrary thing that probably isn't that relevant. I think is probably something I'd advise in order to be fair and inclusive to all.
Thank you. I want to go back to Stephanie, thinking about the campus environment. What advice could would you give to folks who want to raise more awareness, in your case, amongst faculty, staff, and students about the importance of appreciating differently abled colleagues and the importance of being inclusive?
Thanks. This is Stephanie here. I think on campuses you can find a lot of allies in work around disability inclusion. So there's often a lot of accessibility professionals spread throughout the campus. The library and the press may be one of them. An office that provides services for students with disabilities might be another. And an office around institutional equity or diversity and inclusion might be another place. So if you're based on an academic campus or work closely with folks in that world, you have lots of accessibility colleagues already to find. I think that for students and faculty with disabilities, there's also quite a bit of activism, kind of raising awareness around how ableism shows up in the classroom and on the campus, and making sure that folks are getting their needs met according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and recognizing that sometimes on a campus there may be gaps in providing accommodations and services that meet the needs of all students, and especially all faculty and staff, because that tends to be less centralized at this point. So there's a lot of movement around that on my campus and on many. Some are advocating to create disability culture centers on campus as a way of forming community and creating a base for further advocacy. So those are a few places I would direct people to look wherever their own academic environment is.
Thank you so much. Bill, a couple of people mentioned this in their presentations, Benetech Bookshare. That's what I immediately think of when I think of accessible copies. I'm wondering, with the development of EPUB 3, if that's taken some of the burden off of the folks at Benetech Bookshare, in contrast to, say, maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, in terms of what requests they don't need to handle because it's just happening, accessibility as a matter of course.
Yeah, and actually, I'll have to say that it was Betsy Bowman who keynoted SSP a couple of years ago, who actually came up with the concept of Born Accessible. And I was talking to Brad Turner one time. He's head of Bookshare, and he said, our ultimate goal is to put ourselves out of business. We shouldn't have to be doing this. And so, yeah, that's why they introduced this Global Certified Accessible program. They help basically coach publishers. They also work with vendors to get it right. And so they absolutely welcome it when the publisher can provide a fully accessible, properly accessible EPUB 3. I always say that because I refer to EPUB 3, the specification is it provides accessibility ability, right? It doesn't guarantee that all EPUB 3s are just perfectly accessible. You have to use the format properly. You have to get the correct markup, the correct navigation, etc. But if you do provide an accessible EPUB 3, that's great. Benetech doesn't have to do much with it. Now, Stephanie, for example, can just get that EPUB 3 from the publisher and provide it to a student, and won't need to go through Bookshare. But going through Bookshare still makes sense because they're a central point for providing this kind of service for thousands of people around the country. So publishers actually would prefer you could just go to Bookshare and get what you want without bugging them.
Thanks so much. I want to ask one final question to Simon. We don't have a great track record in the publishing industry of being very inclusive, according to the slide and the employment stats that you showed. what advice would you give to someone who came to you, someone who's thinking about a career in publishing, but they do have a disability, and and they are thinking, is this the space for me? What would you tell them?
So this has happened a few times recently, and I would say that the publishing industry is just at the start of their inclusion, their accessibility journey in real terms. But it's also an industry that's super keen to get it right. And therefore, I would say that actually publishing is a really good industry to go into right now if you have a disability, because even though you won't be going into employers who have all the answers, you will likely go into employers who are super keen to understand and to do better and to listen to what you have to say. I'd always encourage people to be an expert on what they need. I think everybody has to be an expert on what they need. And I think that actually things like the SSP and kind of various other inter-publishing initiatives, so things like the Accessible Books Consortium, or I'm involved with a group called Publishing Industry Enabled, or organizations like Purple Space, which is kind of a more general workplace disability inclusion body, are really great at not only providing advice, but also helping people think about the sort of language they use in order to educate their colleagues, because it is a learning experience for everybody. My experience of the publishing industry today is pretty different to when I first entered it. And I mean that in a really positive way, because although I still don't think we've got a lot of the answers, I feel that awareness of accessibility and awareness of diversity more generally, but particularly disability inclusion, is a lot greater than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And that's something that I think we should feel really good about.
Thank you so much. Wow, this was an amazing session to work on. It's almost, as I'm sitting here, like kind of the Avengers. We have an author, we have a publisher, we have a consultant, we've got somebody from the technical side, we've got a librarian who's been educating and working directly with students and staff. So I couldn't ask for a better group to come together and discuss these issues. I do want to again thank Sue and Howard. We discovered we have a maximum of how many videos we can show on a screen at a time, but I would like to thank them for being game to participate in our skit. We hope that you have enjoyed it as much as we have enjoyed putting it together. As Simon mentioned, and I think Letty mentioned as well, any one of us at any time, and eventually, if we're fortunate to live long enough, will have chance of impairment, some sort of impairment, unless we get some super medical advanced technologies, which we're all really hoping for right now, but we won't necessarily put our money on. But all of the resources that folks have mentioned today, all of the perspectives that have been presented, at least give you a place to start for accessibility ability, as Bill said. That's a new one. I'm gonna steal that. And we will look forward to continuing to explore this space with you, and we're very happy that SSP has given us this opportunity to do so. Thank you so much.